Hello there, kia ora. Just a quick note for those of you looking for the second interview tonight with Neil Jones, the former Chief of Staff to Dame Jacinda Ardern. Unfortunately, Neil has come down with a bit of a nasty bug today. He's cancelled on us last minute. We're hoping to have him back in time for Friday, where we've got a bit of a post-budget special going on, so we'll keep you informed and let you know what's happening. Until then, though, please enjoy this interview with Gareth. We'll start that right this second, so enjoy the show.
This is the pre-budget series with Paul the Other One and the BFG podcast. Today's guest is former Green MP Gareth Hughes. Welcome to the program, Gareth.
Kia ora, good evening.
So good to be with you this evening. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing pretty well. Looking forward to the budget that's imminent. This is going to be a real crunch point for the government to really lay out their stall, what they stand for. Budgets are all about sort of, what we stand for as a society and the decisions we make. They can be incredibly powerful tools. So it's a busy time for me and my small team at the Wellbeing Economic Alliance, Aotearoa. Our core mission is to redesign our economic system so they deliver well-being for people and planet by default. It's the economy being in service to people and planet rather than the current way around, which it feels like it's nature and people in service to the economy. So it's a busy time for us, really well.
And good question to roll off on. Do you suspect to get any help in the budget?
I'm not holding my breath, to be honest. The budget could be a powerful tool that drives fairness, that delivers better childhoods for Kiwis growing up. That we have great public transport in our cities, a low carbon economy, electrified, a fairer tax system where the wealthiest are asked to pay more. But as I said, I'm not holding my breath for that. We're not seeing those signals come from national. What we're seeing instead is sort of signals from the government that tax cuts are the most important thing, that we need to prioritise economic growth as measured through GDP, no matter where it comes from. We need to sort of fast track, applications that potentially damage the environment to get there, that Māori have too much power in society, so they need to get rid of Māori wards and the treaty principles. These are all the narratives we're seeing from the government, and I don't think it really aligns with New Zealanders' values, but that's what we're seeing. But, there's still hope.
Fingers crossed. Who do you think this budget's going to be written for then?
Well, again, based on previous messages, the government's been talking about the tough choices they face. For example, last week scrapping first home buyer grants, scrapping things like the public transport subsidy that many parents took advantage of to get their kids to school more cheaply with the cost of living crisis. So it's been talked about the tough choices the government has to make. But unfortunately, the major choice that I think will frame this budget is the $2.9 billion tax breaks for landlords. When they talk about tough choices, it's tough choices for many people in New Zealand, but others are benefiting to a huge degree in that. So I think this is going to be the question. All the cuts we see, Nicola Willis has identified 240 programs that they've identified to cut. We've seen a slowdown in investment, slowdown in school board builds. Kāinga Ora is building substantially less houses under this government to providing needed housing in the middle of a housing crisis for some of our most vulnerable citizens. So everything's going to be set against the huge windfall that landlords are going to get. Now, often we hear the argument that this is an issue of tax fairness when it comes to the different rates of profit and income that businesses face. But the fact is that we do apply different tax rates to different areas. For example, we don't apply GST to rent or rates or other areas. We've collectively in the past made a choice in society that housing is important. I would go so far to say that housing is a human right and it should be guaranteed and provided. We've made those choices before and it could be continued again. And the fact is that prioritising $2.9 billion for landlords at a time when renters, tenants, minimum wage workers are going backwards demonstrates those choices.
The cornerstone of what they've been pushing is obviously the tax cuts, which they call it tax relief. Lowest income earners not going to see very much from it. I believe people on benefits aren't going to see a cent from it. Do you think that the messaging that we've seen so far from the coalition then has been around one where people should be grateful for what they get? Because, some people have it worse. Or do you think it's just they've dug themselves a hole and they can't get out of it now?
Well,
How do you think the messaging has come across?
Well, it's interesting when you talk about tax cuts as a standalone issue in isolation. That sort of makes you think about your personal benefit. How much more you might keep in your back pocket. And what's quite stark is National's been banging this drum for years now. Actually, made it a bottom line commitment that the finance minister Nicola Willis would resign if she didn't deliver it. But what we're seeing is actually large opposition across the country to this at this time. You see from progressive voices that when you talk about tax and budgets together, what we're seeing is to deliver these likely tax cuts is substantial cuts across the country, cuts to things like infrastructure, like the ferries, which we are breaking down. And as an island nation, we need ferries going forward, cancellation to transport projects, particularly public transport, cuts to minimum wage, cuts to disability support. Those cuts are now appearing at the front lines and in some absolutely perverse areas, such as our border protections with custom officers, such as child abuse monitoring from the Department of Internal Affairs. So when you ask progressive voters, they put tax and budgets together and they're asking, will the tax cuts be worth the trade-offs as a society that are likely going to lead to larger problems down the line, be it poverty or crime or greater emissions? But even right-wing pundits are critical of these tax cuts because National hasn't identified any substantial revenue. We know that 311 wealthiest families in New Zealand are paying a tax rate effectively half that rate of nurses or teachers. The government's not asking the wealthiest to pay more. They're not asking anyone to pay more through a fairer tax system. So it's likely that National's going to rely on borrowing to be able to deliver their tax cuts. So even the New Zealand Institute, a sort of right-wing think tank, has come out highly critical. So National has found themselves in a real bind here because they've promised it, but it's really hard to make the case when you see all the cuts, and it's hard to make the case when you're going to have to borrow to deliver it. So the real challenge they've got is that they need to deliver it. They need to deliver something that's meaningful, not just a chewing gum approach. However, they need to do it in such a fashion that it's not inflationary and keeps the official cash rate higher and increases people's interest rates, that doesn't rely on too much borrowing. But then they've got the political challenge too, because during the election campaign, they talked about $250 a week. That was the headline. But when you looked at the small print, it was up to $250 a week. And when people such as Craig Rennie actually dived into their numbers, what you see was only a very small minority. I think only 3,000 families would likely benefit from those up to $250 a week. Most would be on a matter of dollars, and some, particularly those without children, would be only $2 a week better off. And when you take into account what's happened with the minimum wage and not progressing as fast as that should have been progressing, you're seeing many people actually go backwards.
So with the right, even the right economists like Brett Olson and so on, basically not agreeing with the government on a policy like this, how much of a bad look is it for this coalition government then?
With the tax cuts?
That their own economists are not happy with it. Is it a bad look in your opinion, or like not?
I think it's going to be challenging for National. I think you're referring to like the optics, as political pundits put it. And National is really in an invidious position where there's a chorus from across the political spectrum saying now's not the time. I think how she's likely to square the circle is scale back the size of the tax cuts massively. We've seen the language of both the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister change over the last few weeks, talking about this budget in the context of the next two budgets in the 3-year term. So I think they're likely to be staging these issues. But we don't know until we actually get to see the budget books open on Thursday afternoon. And then we'll see how they've managed to square the circle, if they have. I'd love to see a government that's actually not going to reverse the bright line test, which was like a proxy capital gains tax. We've got such wealth inequality in this country. And as we see from the pecuniary interest of politicians, those elected officials are putting their money in their capital where they think they can get the most income from, and that's our housing system. And that's why we've got such an unproductive economy that's focused on housing. That's one reason why we've got such unaffordable housing, because we're seeing it as an investment to speculate on rather than a human right that should be provided. So the choices are there for National. We're yet to see where they'll settle.
When it comes to choices for National, I'm actually kind of curious how much you think the influence of ACT and New Zealand First are going to come through in this budget.
Oh, I imagine substantially. I've been involved in, budgets as a government support party member, and you want to get, as much mileage as you can out of the initiatives that you're part of. Remember, this is our first coalition government where three parties are sitting around the cabinet table together. They'll be doing their utmost to secure any wins and big policy expenditure. New Zealand First historically is really focused on economic development with the Provincial Growth Fund and others. They got a huge financial concession during the coalition negotiations, which was rejecting National's overseas buyers tax, removing the ban and applying a tax on top. That left a gigantic fiscal hole in National's numbers leading into the budget. Likewise, ACT is, on one hand, disestablishing the Productivity Commission, but then establishing something even larger, which is the Regulatory Commission, and they'll be looking at their expenditure too, for example, on things like charter schools. So this is the challenge for National. They've got to keep those members happy. But that's the political challenge that National has going into the budget as well. Not only all the financial pressures and the chorus against the tax cuts that they're seeing. The fact is that the government over the last 6 months has been dominated by the voices of Winston Peters and David Seymour, and National struggled for oxygen, struggled to really put a positive agenda forward. We know what they don't stand for, which is Labour's agenda. We know their slogan is "Get New Zealand back on track," but we're not actually sure where that is. And many people might be scratching their head and saying, do they refer to the 1950s when you talk about treaty policy and race relations and fast-track legislation? But also get the country back on track just isn't being shared by the majority of voters, with 52% in a recent poll saying they don't think the country's on the right direction. So National has a political problem, which is they need to actually express who they stand for, and budgets are a really important moment for this. So they'll be taking it seriously and trying to make sure National is first and foremost, but New Zealand First and ACT will be nipping at their heels.
Yep. This is a generic question that I've been asking our lineup this week. So I've been watching a lot of the sports awards and a lot of the galas and events that Mr. Luxon has been speaking at the last weeks and months, and there seems to be quite a significant trend. Whenever he mentions himself, the audience goes quiet, and whenever he mentions opposition parties, they get a big ovation. So, in your opinion, is that a big problem for this current government, that they are seem to be losing support already?
Yeah, and it's historically surprising and very interesting. It feels like our politics is in a lot of flux at the moment and has been in recent years, compared to sort of the periods of long stability we saw when we switched to MMP in 1999. Historically, we've had three-term governments are immensely popular and slowly leaking support and eroding over time to more competitive elections, and the second one, such as Helen Clark with Don Brash, or when David Shearer was outpolling John Key in the National Party in the mid-2010s. What we've seen under this current government is a massive slip in popularity. As I mentioned before, the right track, wrong track has absolutely plummeted in 2024. We're seeing the parties of the opposition in a combined fashion being able to form a government if a vote was held now in multiple polls now. And we see the Prime Minister with historically very low net favourability ratings. So this will be a worry for National, because governments like to store up sort of political capital, and knowing that it's going to erode over time, it feels like they've got there already. Again, I'm not surprised, because remember, this is a coalition government where National's in an incredibly weak position. The share of the vote going to larger parties, both National and Labour, are back down to 1990s levels after Rogernomics, Ruthanasia, and the hangover that caused. They're at a historically low point. The the medium parties, the ACTs, the Greens, the New Zealand First, are larger as a share than they have been before. I'm also not surprised because when you look at the coalition agreement, the 100-day plan, this has been a very negative government focused on getting rid of many policies of the previous government, not really a positive agenda, but also really embracing some pretty contentious policies. I would put it this is our most right-wing and extreme government since Ruth Richardson was putting the mother of all budgets together in the very early 90s. This is a government that's picking fights on bathrooms and transgender rights. It's picking a fight with Māoridom, with the Treaty of Waitangi Principles Bill, Te Whaiora, a whole bunch of Māori ward policies and others, the fast-track legislation trying to ram through what could be very damaging projects such as seabed mining and the environment which people deeply connect to in Aotearoa. They're really barging their way through, taking on some incredibly unpopular policies driven by the extremes of the coalition with ACT and New Zealand First. I just don't think it really aligns with New Zealanders' values, and that's why you're seeing this reflected in this pretty bad polling.
And do you think people were voting that wanted change and are now regretting it because they are saying, oh, this is not what we were hoping for. We were hoping for a break from Labour to get something a bit different, and now we've got too much of a difference.
I think that's pretty.
Yeah,
I think that's pretty clear that people that maybe switch side are regretting it. We did see Labour with a historic, unprecedented majority government see a historic fall in votes, and much of that went to national or the coalition parties. So when you look at the polls, it's pretty clear that some people will be regretting that. But I think that should be a wake-up call for parties of the left as well, and not a reason to rest on your laurels or sit on your hands, is that there were a large number of voters that deserted the government. You could say it was a repudiation of the previous government and some of the actions they took. So I hope no party's sort of resting on their laurels. They're actually thinking, well, how can we actually develop policies that are going to make a meaningful difference? From my personal perspective, this was a Labour government that was talking transformational change, that made child poverty and climate change their signature issues, but didn't make as much progress as the rhetoric implied, didn't take concrete steps that would have made a more tangible difference, and we're still very much in the shadow of the revolution that occurred in 1984. We'll be celebrating the 40th anniversary in a couple of months, which was our neoliberal revolution, where we privatised everything, put profit first, and saw the environment as something that we could trade off against profit. People are really negatively responding to that. They're seeing that trickle-down policies just aren't working. Things like child poverty, inequality, just aren't being fixed, despite Kiwis wanting them to. So, sure, National's dropping in popularity. There were reasons why there was a change of government, and I think the challenge for all parties now going forward is, gosh, how do we actually get this country working in the right way, dealing with those big challenges facing us? And this is why budgets are important. They're the signature event of the year, but they're also great opportunities that collectively as a society we can use tax and budgets to deal with those challenges. Let's see if a party's going to step up and do it.
I was going to say, have you had any thoughts then on the pre-budget announcements that we have heard so far, sort of the hints of what's behind the pages?
Well, what we've seen, I guess, is the headline announcements is cuts again, right? Nicola Willis has identified $1.5 billion in cuts, 240 different programs she intends to end. And we're seeing real stories of people losing their job. In Wellington, where I live, I think it's about 4,000 people have lost the job. It's impossible not to meet someone or know someone who's been affected by that. And we're seeing it, in our provincial towns as well. So I think that's really flowing through, deeply unpopular. We're seeing some of the other policies, such as charter schools, roads of national significance, the funding for Gumfruit Friday, which I think is a very damaging precedent for New Zealand, that we can have private charities funded through personal relationships rather than appropriate procurement and tender policies, which also reminds us of the housing policies of the government, which is Bill English's not so independent review that took $500,000 from emergency funding, and we discovered last night was basically arranged over a series of text messages between the minister and the former prime minister, rather than, again, a proper process and a proper tendering procurement policy. So I don't believe the policies that have been announced are particularly popular. But again, we'll actually see the detail when the budget is released.
As somebody who's worked on budgets before, are the pre-budget announcements the ones that are designed to make us think this is a good thing that we're going to be looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, they'll be saving the big bang in their back pocket to release on the day. But coming from my political background, the parties will be negotiating a calendar of events where the support parties will be having the limelight on their policy. That would have been mapped out well in advance, and that's how the budget process worked. It is sort of negotiated behind the scenes and then revealed in a very staged, managed fashion. Sometimes that comes a cropper, such as when Treasury accidentally published the budget online and people could access it online. It's interesting too to reflect how budgets have changed. In the 30s through to even the 70s, they were sort of much watched event where people's lives could change depending on the announcement of the finance minister, say as Robert Muldoon putting a price freeze, or the black budget of Nordemeyer in the 50s that massively increased excise and taxes. I remember when I first entered Parliament in 2010, people still used to walk around the parliamentary precinct with dolly trolleys full of giant boxes full of the budget papers. And I had about 5 big boxes of papers trundle into my office after the budget with all the detail. Then it came on a flash drive, and now it's all online and graphic. Maybe not as big a deal as it once was, because the major macro settings don't change as much between budgets, and they're sort of drip fed out in the weeks preceding it. But still a huge event.
Pomp and ceremony.
So we were talking in preparation for this interview this evening about my Waikaha campaign, and another question I've been asking the majority of our guests this week is how two-sided or two-faced is it for the government to say, okay, we can keep Kaianga Ora as a Maori name because it's culturally appropriate, but now they are telling the Waikaha or the Ministry of Disabled People, oh, you've got to change your name because, as a part of our policy, but yet it's apparently their legal name, as we've discovered. So it seems a bit, two-sided. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think it does appear two-sided and hypocritical. I also note that it's not being applied uniformly. I was quite pleased to see the Minister of Conservation, Tama Potaka, in a memo to Department of Conservation staff saying, sure, use, te reo, say kia ora, say namahi at the end of an email. So I think that was really refreshing that it's not being so brutally applied. Look, we're in Aotearoa in the bottom of the Pacific. Te reo is a tahaonga, a treasure that we should be celebrating and using more. And I think National is actually going against sort of the direction of travel. It's really normal now for people to use elements of te reo in everyday conversation. It's incredibly normal for people to know their pepeha and being able to introduce themselves as part of whakawhanaungatanga and building relations with people. This is normal in the corporate world in Aotearoa and New Zealand now. So this is when the government says back on track. It's a very backwards looking approach that kind of feels like the 1950s. But what is really damaging isn't just the names of entities, it's the actual policies that are being promoted by the government around the Māori Health Authority, around the Treaty of Waitangi, around Māori wards that 2 weeks ago we saw 52 mayors from across the country.
Can I just interrupt for 2 seconds and remind everyone that tonight at 11:59 is the last day for submissions. If they want to make a submission around the removal of Māori wards, they can do that at parliament.nz.
Oh, well, it's an urgent one, and I suspect, like the fast-track legislation, we're going to see an absolute ton come through.
Yeah, I hope so. Absolutely hope so. It's kind of scary just how fast they're moving on things like that, particularly around Te Reo Māori, the use of Te Ao Māori, and there's a bit of whiplash there, I think, for people. They get shocked by it.
Yeah, and I don't, again, think it's shared by the majority. I think, the majority actually see how Māori doing well actually sees the whole country do well. In my space working on economics, the innovative thinking in both business and economics is coming from Māori thinkers. We're seeing entities such as Wakatu in the top of the south, the largest employer in that region, now having a 500-year strategy rather than just the quarterly strategy that is so prominent. Groups like Tuhui talking about see the economy and the environment as intrinsically connected. Well, we're seeing a lot of language at the moment that we need to sacrifice frogs and kiwis and places of the natural conservation estate that we love to promote mining or oil drilling or seabed mining. But again, what we don't see that from Māori entities that see the environment as the basis of prosperity. So we are seeing a backlash. We're seeing the Kotahitanga movement really unifying Māoridom, and actually maybe while it feels like a few steps backwards at the moment, this could be a catalyst that actually New Zealand embraces Te Rere and uses it to really think more long term, to think more connected to nature, to incorporate future generations into our thinking.
How likely is it that we're going to see our first one-term government in a long time?
Oh, I think it's pretty even odds. When you look at the polling and the very sudden erosion of that polling, it's a likelihood. At this point in the cycle, when you're seeing multiple polls showing a change of government, it just shows it more likely. I think what we're seeing is a period of a bit more volatility in our politics. That old stability of multiple term governments feels like it's eroding. Many people reflected on the Labour government and going through COVID that it felt like it was 3 terms already. So it feels like a grumpy electorate, that things are speeding up. When you look around the world, there's so much more political volatility as well. And this is a coalition that, remember, New Zealand First and ACT were going hammer and tongs at each other, saying they wouldn't sit around a cabinet table. They didn't trust each other. They have made it work so far. But remember, New Zealand First 3 times has dropped below 5% after being in government. They've got a history of going into government and then being booted out again. And they're not polling considerably high at the moment. So if New Zealand First drops out, the likelihood of a opposition parties coming together to form a government increases. So, I think every party's got something to play for.
After the Roy Morgan poll that came out yesterday, and I mean, Roy Morgan's not a great poll anyway because of their methodology being a very long period of collection. New Zealand First is sitting on average at 4.9% of the party vote over all the polls that we've seen this year. So that I think they're freaking out a little bit. And that's why you hear Winston making a lot of noise about bathroom bills and freedom of speech bills and making English an official language, because it speaks to his new base.
And it's always been difficult for New Zealand First. They often campaign as sort of an opposition movement, opposing the elites in society. But then, he's the deputy prime minister, he's the foreign minister.
Again,
there's a huge amount of grumpiness in the electorate, and it's hard to be both things to both people, an elder statesman and the vehicle for this frustration and disillusionment in society. And I think we're seeing that reflected. And he's grasping for these different issues. But again, I think Kiwis are a fair people, got good values, and these sort of imported culture wars I don't think really are resonating.
We were talking about this earlier this week with Matthew Tukake, and so he was agreed with me that Mr. Peters would possibly die in office. Do you feel the same way?
Oh, I'm not sure, and I wouldn't wish that. It's an all-encompassing lifestyle, and I've seen MPs pass away in that location, and it's a tragedy for their families. As someone who served more than 10 years there myself, I'm so glad I got out and got to experience life and time with my family, and I hope that for Winston as well. But despite the politics and many of his policies, which I strongly disagree with, he is one of our most significant politicians of several generations. I published the book, The Biography of Jeanette Fitzsimons, and it was interesting tracking her career as the first Green Party eco-leader, coincided with Winston Peters as young people growing up in the 70s and battling some of the issues of their age. And he's had a phenomenal career from the law, from being a Māori All Black, being a miner once when I visited a hydroelectric station in Australia. He's got a very storied past. And I think, however, when you look at politics today, it doesn't reflect the politics of New Zealand's future. These battles over the treaty, these battles over gender and bathrooms, it reflects a very old New Zealand. And I think, it would be nice for Mr. Peters to enjoy a retirement.
I was actually kind of disappointed he didn't get to do the whole valedictory speech after. Well, he did a valedictory speech, didn't he? After New Zealand first dropped out in the last term, he was invited back for it.
Oh, I've got a vague memory of that.
Yeah,
But it's fascinating that he's been booted out so many times and still fights to get back and has succeeded on multiple times as well. Remember, he's of the generation that's guaranteed a parliamentary pension after he retired. I don't know why he's not kicking back and doing some fishing on the beach.
I would if I was him. He's certainly earned it. Right? No matter what you think of his politics and opinions, he's definitely earned a chance to have a break.
Anything else from you, Paul?
Yeah, I have one more question for you. What sort of big surprise are you predicting to come out of the budget, if any?
Well, I'm not predicting it because I haven't just heard enough talk or chatter or signals. I think the interesting thing is, will National be able to find a large enough source of revenue that's meaningful to pay for the tax cuts without resorting to large scale borrowing? I did see the Minister for Social Development, Louise Upston, opine around the working for families, which is kind of a subsidy for employers to keep wages low, but also very needed because New Zealanders work some of the longest hours for some of the lowest wages and pay some of the highest cost of living in the developed world. Some support's needed. That would be a huge, radical, bold call to remove something like that, or the accommodation supplement, which are often seen as sort of ambulances at the bottom of the cliff. They've made that argument in a small way when it came to the first home buyer grants. I don't think it's likely at all, but where they can find some revenue without taxes, previous governments have introduced levies or other sort of areas to bring in revenue. They've done that with vehicle registrations as one sort of switch around. So where that revenue source is going to come from could be the big surprise.
Fantastic. That's all my questions. I've learned everything I need to know, other than I'm going to need a lot of drinks tomorrow.
Yeah. And that's all from me as well. So, thank you for coming on, Gareth. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. And yeah.
Where can people find more information about what you're up to these days, Gareth?
At the Wellbeing Economic Alliance Aotearoa website, or check us out online. Look, I think this is the most important mission facing us. How do we get the economy working in service to people and planet, not the other way around? We saw that recent Ipsos poll that majority of Kiwis think the economy is rigged in favour of corporate interests. But we also know that Kiwis do want to think about intergenerational long-term planning. They do want to invest in infrastructure and an economy of care. And that's sort of my message and my mahi, that the economy is a system that was designed. We can redesign it to get the outcomes we want to see.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, thank you.